to the second installment of our shell and pearl button study. And for those of you who have not seen part one, as we discussed earlier, you can put your email into the chat part of Zoom, and we'll send you a link for part one. In part one, we looked at iridescent and non-iridescent buttons and some clues to identifying the shells that your buttons were made from. But now we're on to decorative finishes and uniting methods. The National Button Society defines decorative finishes as surface treatments or a coating applied to the base material of the button. The first subclass listed is dyed shell. We're all familiar with this type of dyed shell button from the 1940s.
Uh-oh. I muted you. Sorry.
Okay, am I talking now?
Yes, I muted everyone. Bye. I'm sorry.
That's all right. Do I have to start from the beginning?
No, you can just keep talking about the modern dyed shell.
Okay. This first class listed is dyed shell, and we're all familiar with this type of dyed shell button from the 30s, 40s, and 50s. These were made from mussel shell, and they were probably made in Muscatine, Iowa, and nearby areas. Note that some of them get their carved designs after the dyeing process, like these two buttons, and the rest were carved first and then dyed. But these more modern buttons don't compare with older Division I buttons. Oops. The first flower button in this photo is much yellower than it appears, and you can tell by looking at the back of it that the whole shell was dyed yellow. And the other three buttons were all carved before they were dyed. The center top is a steel cup, and the top right is a medium watch wheel. And we'll talk more about those in part 3 of our study, what a watch wheel is. Another type of dyeing technique is wax resist. The surface of this button is perfectly smooth to the touch. Here, the artist painted his design in wax on all the parts he wanted to be white. The button was then dyed with the color adhering to those other unwaxed parts. Wax resist buttons are less common than dyed and carved examples that we will see next. Now these buttons were dyed first and then carved to show contrast. And one thing I did learn that was kind of new to me in this study was that most of these types of buttons are dyed green snail shell. I suspect that's because it takes the dye evenly while still allowing the iridescence to shine. Additionally, the two buttons on the left are engraved, and then the engraved lines painted with gold colored paint. That's also known as gilded. That brings us to our next category of decorative finishes, gilded. And it's defined as colored with gold and or silver paint or gold leaf. These finishes are delicate and in many cases have worn off over time, and the silver is darkened as well. This type of decorative finish is used quite a bit in the Art Nouveau style designs, as you see here. Here are two more examples. Note that the deer is gilded and painted, and that's our next decorative finish class, painted. These four painted buttons represent card suits, and they came to me in an old collection before the days when studio artists signed their work. I do not know who made them, so if anybody has anything similar or any information about them, I would love to know a little bit more about them. This is a Persian painted pearl. I've seen jewelry painted in the same style, both on pearl and on bone. The painting was then sealed with a coating in an effort to protect the design. But this particular button is in good condition. That's not usually the case. Now these two are worthy of ooh and ah because they're very unusual. They're Brooks buttons painted on pearl. Edith and Alan Brooks were from England and were known for their small hand-painted cassine buttons. I know of a few more of the Brooks buttons painted on pearl, but they are relatively rare. These two are large, measuring 1 3/8 inch each. The NBS classification lists the painted decorative finish class as painted/paint encrusted. And when there is a slash between two descriptions, it means that they are treated the same in competition. You would only garner 1 point for covering the painted class. On this button, you can see that his head and body have a bit of dimension. A base material was applied to these sections before painting over them to build up the design and achieve this effect. The next class in decorative finish is transfer decals, as you can see on these modern buttons. The button on the right did indeed come from France. In fact, I purchased it the last time I was there, purchased it there. And the Laminate buttons on the left, which are marketed as vintage, are modern. It says circa 1860 to 1900, but they're actually talking about the type of button and design. Laminate manufactured a line of the vintage style buttons, and I think it was late, like 2008, 2009, something like that. These are older Division I transfer designs. Oh, yeah, transfer designs. This is a lovely lady from the last turn of the century. And the second photo shows transfer designs in a variety of patterns, again, over green snail shell. These were very fragile finishes. Both photos can show a lot of deterioration to the design. Division I buttons transfer designs just didn't seem to be very well protected. It's very hard to find them in good condition. Now, modern technology has produced buttons that don't easily fit into our class of decorative finishes. These two buttons were made in France. The first shell button is flocked, just like the wallpaper, as best as I can tell. The second button has a paint job that looks like cold enamel or epoxy. I have even seen pearl buttons finished with glitter. I would probably include these in competitions as unlisted decorative finishes. And now we come to mechanical makeup, which is defined as the various techniques used to join two or more button components together. The class was formerly called uniting methods. In my opinion, an easier term to understand than mechanical makeup. The first type of mechanical makeup in the shell class is a frame, where the body of the shell forms a frame for any material other than shell. Here's a porcelain transfer disc set into shell, and then a litho under a celluloid shield covering set into shell. Many 18th century pearls can be described as frames as well. The first octagon-shaped button has a central brass disc, and the second has an underglass sulfide design of Hercules. And this button, with a painting on ivory set in metal, is framed by the pearl button, which also happens to be inlaid with copper and silver metal strips. And that brings us to our next class, inlay and insets. Inlays are flush with the surface of the button. They can be a material other than shell, like the previous photo, or made of shell, like the first two buttons shown. The Nancy Du Bois pen shell button is pearl oyster set into pen shell, and the second one is a Bethlehem pearl with abalone set into pearl oyster shell. The third button is goldstone set into pearl. Remember that the key to inlays is that they are flush with the surface. Also realize that the third button could be used in the class for frame. Insets are not flush with the surface of the button. They can be different materials, like the black glass, which is set in a groove carved into the shell, but the glass itself sits above the channel surface. The center button is two types of shell, with the center sitting up higher than the surface of the rim. The dragonfly is an inset as well, also not flat. Note that the surface of the button has been carved with indentations to accommodate the dragonfly escutcheon. The next class listed for uniting methods is laminate. In this process, layers of shell are glued together and then the edges cut away to reveal the layers. We had looked at the button on the right in part one, where you had green, I think it was green snail in the middle, and maybe it was actually an opposite coloring, but you have the light and dark glued together and then they cut away at the edges, and this one is just beautiful. Veneer is another method of putting two parts together. In veneer, covers the entire surface of the shell button. It's shown in these two examples. This is the side of this button, but it looks very much just like the side view of the button up top. What you will also note that this is an inlay as well. And you discover in pearl buttons is that they often fit into more than one class. Now, if you look at the photo on the left, you will think it's a pearl button. But don't confuse a veneer pearl over a bone base as a pearl button. Make sure you look at the backs of your buttons. This base is bone, so it's considered a bone button. And you can recognize bone by the tan color and the brown dots. Overlay buttons, which is our next class, I think are just beautiful. Overlay is defined as a separate layer of shell attached to the face of a shell button. It can be attached by gluing, a pin shank, or steel rivets. Contrasting colors of shell cover the entire white base in the bird button, attached with steel rivets. The white on white pearl is also pinned together with rivets for this great design. Both the anchor and the green man face are pinned to a separate base with rivets. They both have gold paint, so they are gilded. In addition, the base of the green man has been dyed red. You can see that around the edges and through his mouth. So this button has more than one decorative finish, as well as being an overlay. It fits into a number of classes. In the button with the fantastic heart, see how cleverly the artist used the rivets as part of the design and to join the two pieces together. And the same is true of the button on the right. The rivets are the flower centers. The dyed border makes a great contrast. However, this button would not be a good choice to use in the dyed section of the class, as the decorative finish needs to be on the base of the button. The dyed portion is not the base, but it's a great choice for the gilded class because of the gold paint in all the grooves. And of course, it's great to use in the United class. Here's an overlay that's glued. The abalone shell fan has been glued to what I believe is a white pearl oyster base. Glue as a uniting method is not as common as those that are pinned, especially in Division 1. Perhaps they did not hold up as well. Pictured here is an overlay that is achieved with a pin shank in this 18th century example. It's actually 4 layers. It's an unusual 18th century button because it uses the dark part of the oyster shell, which is not commonly seen in 18th century buttons. They tend to usually be white. And now for the big finish. The swan button is an overlay pearl set in metal. It's a dyed button because the base of the button is dyed pearl. And it could also be used in the decorative finish class for gilded as well. And most importantly of all, it's just so darn beautiful, I had to include it. Well, we've covered the decorative finish classes: dyed, painted, gilded, transferred decal, and a few unlisted. We have looked at uniting methods, frames, inlay, inset, laminate, veneer, and overlay. Next time, we'll finish up our pearl study and look at mounted in metal, other material embellishments, as we fondly refer to as OME, and working methods: carved, engraved, pierced, also set in metal. So be sure to stay tuned to New Jersey's Facebook site for more information.